So one thing that comes up a lot when I'm talking to my friends about where to move, they'll ask, what is there to do in blank city? What are you gonna do in New York, right? I'm gonna be in New York, there's a lot to do there. What do you wanna do there? So on, right? It's really focused on the activities that a city has to provide, but I think you're gonna come up short, right? It's an experience that you see a lot in tourism, right? You run out of sights to see. You're eventually gonna come up with the same question, which is, how do I spend my time in ways that feel important to me? And then after solving that question, then you're like, okay, how is it different doing that in this city versus another city, right? So one thing that I wish I spent more time on is focusing on what am I gonna do with my time that is central to my identity and that I feel important doing? And then, is it different in New York? Is it different in the Bay Area? Is it different in these other places, right? Rather than expecting where you are to be the thing providing the substance to your time. Does that make sense? San Francisco, right? I was born and raised there, and it's basically New York, except makes absolutely no sense culturally, but also from a city design perspective, okay?
So?
Have you been there?
I've never been there.
Okay, so New York is a perfect grid and numbered in both directions. A lot of times it has street names that make sense and are very recognizable, and pretty straightforward to drive in, even though the traffic is absolute bonkers, right? San Francisco has random naming of streets. It doesn't go in alphabetical order or in number order in any way, shape, or form in the inner city. And half the streets are one-way streets. They randomly stop for buildings and start going the other way. Market Street cuts off the grid at like a 40-degree angle. You can't stop on it. And then it continues at a different angle, right? And then just goes bananas in like the rest of the city, okay? So it's so hilly that you can't really comfortably walk everywhere, but also the public transit system isn't consistent enough across the streets such that it stops at regular intervals, right? So what happens is people kind of self-segregate based on where in the city that they're from. So like I've noticed that if you live in, say, the Mission District, you're rarely ever gonna interact with people who live in, say, Soma or in the Financial District, right? And they'll never interact with people who live in the Sunset and so on, right? Whereas in New York, everyone has to kind of mesh together because most people take the subway, right? And because of that, there is sort of a culture of people melding together. So you'll have random conversations with people much more than you will in the Bay Area, right? There's a diner and a deli here near me that I go to pretty much every other day or almost every day, okay? They know me by name and they'll say hi and start conversations with me every time I walk in, and that's kind of the culture here. In the Bay Area, there's places I'll go to almost every day and I'll go there for years. They won't say a single thing to me, they won't even know my name, all right? That's kind of the culture here, and that's a big reason why I like it here more.
Well, I've never been to San Francisco. The only thing I can say for San Francisco, you know, when you're comparing it to New York for all its faults, the one thing they do have over New York is a successful NBA franchise in the Warriors.
That's
but true. How is the culture of tech startups there compared to, say, the work culture here in New York? New York is quite diverse because you got your financial bros and you got, you know, it's very diverse. Whereas
it's tricky because in New York, I still don't work in tech here at the moment, so I can't really speak for certain about what it's like to be in it, but I will say that among the people that I know who work in tech, they're more open to spending time with people who don't work in tech. Whereas all my friends in the Bay Area who work in tech only hang out with other people in tech, right? So it's more homogenous with people in the Bay Area versus here in New York. There are people who work in tech but don't also do climbing, and that's it, right? Like in New York, it's more diversity here.
Let's talk about creative stimulant.
Okay, here we go.
What would you say that New York stimulated you create more creatively than San Francisco? Or if not, what stimulated you creatively in San Francisco, and what stimulates you creatively here in New York?
Ooh, so everyone says they go to New York because of the creative inspiration, because that's where a bunch of creators are and there's that energy and all that stuff. I made a video about this a few months ago, actually before I moved, and I still agree with it. I think that it's kind of bullshit, right? There's more distractions and there's more opportunity to socialize, but creatively, all the things you would really do to do work in your art or craft or creative endeavor, you probably could have done in the Bay Area, right? If it weren't for the social aspects. Would you agree with that?
Well, again, it's hard for me to compare it to San Francisco. I've never been there.
Or would you agree that creativity doesn't require a specific city?
Yes, agreed.
Yeah.
Creativity comes from inside.
Yeah.
But being in a city like New York, where creatives are abundant, it definitely helps to be inspired. It definitely helps with inspiration and to be around similar-minded folk.
Yes. I think it does help you not stop or not get tired of doing things that are quote unquote creative, and it helps you not lose motivation. But for someone who is guaranteed to spend the same amount of time working on their craft every single day for a long period of time or indefinitely, it wouldn't matter.
Would you also say that it's because the culture of New York is constantly fast-moving, fast-paced? Now, does that extend to your profession in creative? Like, you don't want to be left behind. New York is constantly moving here, moving there.
Well, I'm also not the most ambitious person in the world. So, in the traditional sense, right? I'm not the most ambitious compared to people that I know here that would describe themselves as ambitious. I don't think I'm that ambitious. So I wouldn't say so, but I know some of my friends who are TikTokers or YouTubers. I keep saying the phrase some of my friends. That's just because I meet a lot of people here in New York who work in YouTube or TikTok or at media companies and so on. So they're really my main point of reference for what it's typically like for someone there. But I wouldn't say that I'm a typical quote-unquote creative person here because I'm not super I haven't posted in months, right?
Let me pivot. With the fast-paced nature of New York City, how does that compare to San Francisco in terms of working as a creative?
Specifically with what I was doing, for example, working for BuzzFeed, right, and making a video series there. The fast-paced culture itself probably didn't help that much because I was probably working the same amount. Because the pace itself doesn't really affect that much, right? Because I would make videos at the same rate if I was in the Bay Area, right? I would spend the same amount of time, probably, if I was in the Bay Area. I'm using Bay Area and San Francisco interchangeably here, right? Oliver's not from the Bay Area. Yeah, there is a fast pace, but what does it actually do? Well, what do you think?
I mean, for me personally, New York affects me in a way where, because I started off in the corporate America, where it was drilled into my head that time is money. You know, if you're not making money, you're wasting. If you're not making money, you're wasting time. But I also have a lot of friends in California, and when I visited out there, time more or less slows down, or at least it feels that way. People are much more relaxed and chill, and sometimes I don't feel as productive. And I don't know, I haven't lived in LA or I haven't lived in California to make a full judgment, but I know that being in a fast-paced city like New York keeps me on my toes because I don't want to feel like I'm being left behind.
It would be helpful if the pace motivates you to stay fast working such that it's like a noticeable improvement over the baseline. But here it's just that everything's so expensive that that's the normal, right? Such that it's not even really a benefit to have a fast pace. It's more of like, well, yeah, obviously. Does that make sense? Yeah. Right? It's more of a given rather than a privilege or a benefit or an advantage, right? In the Bay Area, I think people also were like that because of Silicon Valley tech culture. I don't think I felt the slow, relaxed pace that I think you're describing, but it's also because I went to UC Berkeley, which is a very, very toxic school in a lot of senses.
When you think about New York, San Francisco, LA, there are multiple events that house creativity or, events that help foster these kinds of communities that may not be present in smaller towns. What do you say to up-and-coming or aspiring creatives that live in these smaller communities? Do you recommend that they potentially try to spread their wings and find communities that foster their creativity?
So I have a very unpopular opinion here. Well, first of all, I am still an aspiring up-and-coming creative. I don't think I'm in a place to give advice to anyone because I'm still kind of in that position. But for me, I feel like to be in a big city and network, right, with a bunch of people, it's been motivating, but I don't think it directly helps the creative aspect or the actual work. I don't think that's a very unpopular take, but I don't think, like for example, there's a bunch of networking events here where you get to meet people who also work in your field, work in your space, and so on. And aside from the obvious benefit of getting referrals to new jobs or new projects, yes, and collaborations in terms of actual work, I don't think it helps at all. I think it actually could be a downside because you kind of become more obsessed and satisfied with having something to show for what you're doing socially and to other people, and in terms of like your network and from a cloud perspective, than your actual craft, right? For example, I don't think I'm bounded in any craft that I've ever pursued. I'm not bounded by the lack of such a network like that, right? I just haven't made enough videos, for example, right? I could have been in a completely different city and found some way to just make videos every day, right? And I just haven't done that in the same amount, right? I felt like New York has provided me a lot of things, but it hasn't changed that core factor that is the pivotal determining factor in whether or not I progress in my craft, right? Which is the actual making of the content, right? Which I think happens a lot here, where it feels like you're being busy and it feels like you're being productive because you're being very social and you're networking a lot, but it doesn't actually develop you in the craft, which is a mistake that I've constantly caught myself making.